UAE, and good afternoon to everyone over in Australia, and welcome to all our speakers. Before we get stuck into the dialogue, Trends just wanted to take the opportunity, particularly given the context of today's talk, to announce that Trends will be opening a virtual office in Australia, in Canberra, in the coming few months.
Before we get stuck into
while this will start as a virtual office hosted by
the opportunity
in Canberra,
given the context of today's talk,
the aim will be to explore the opportunity to turn into a physical office, given the trajectory of the work and the outputs that unfold. Very briefly, the office will start with three main themes that have emerged as central pillars that the recently signed Australia-UAE Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the CEPA, aims to empower. The first pillar is critical minerals, green hydrogen, and the clean energy supply chain. The second pillar is maritime, port, and logistics infrastructure. And the third pillar is artificial intelligence, deep tech, and the innovation economy pipeline. The foundation of the work of the office will start with a strategically designed series of policy-oriented research and analysis produced by and with key Australian thinkers and practitioners in these spaces. And that research and analysis will act as a springboard for us to work collaboratively with our future partners in Australia to co-establish events, forums, conferences, dialogues, and other forms of stakeholder network building initiatives that will be aimed to collaboratively advance the policy thinking space or spaces around these themes and these issues, and indeed more broadly to start spurring to progress towards them, both in our region here and of course in Australia, and at the nexus of the two. We'll announce the substantive details of the office in due course, but we really wanted to take the opportunity of today to say that we can't wait to get stuck in and to start building partnerships with Australian thinkers and doers and practitioners to collaboratively move forward. And in that sense, we are particularly blessed, and it's all very ideal that we have the caliber of speakers that we have today. Dr. Bruni, Raylene, Anthony, and Dr. Gordon, all of who represent Australia's top policy thinking institutions, and indeed in the past have been at the centre of Australian policy making itself in multiple cases. So we're very blessed to have those speakers providing their insights on today's topic, which is how Australia has been seeing and experiencing the Iran war. And we're looking forward very much to their insights. So I'll hand over to my colleague Sheikha, who will provide some opening remarks, and then we'll get stuck in.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, on behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, CEO of Trends Group, I am pleased to welcome you all to this renewed intellectual evening as a part of Trends Strategic Dialogue series, which we launched several weeks ago. Today, we arrive at its 13th session, where we discuss how Australia views the war in the Middle East. Despite the cessation of intensive military operations between the United States, Israel, and Iran, and the return of the negotiating table in what appears to be a fragile attempt to reach an agreement capable of restoring the lost stability and security in the region, rebuilding the trust that has collapsed between neighboring states and Iran, and repairing maritime supply chains exhausted by their subjection to Iranian blackmail, represented by threats to close the strait. It remains clear to all the observers that the military, political, and economic repercussions of this war are not confined to the regional countries directly affected by it. Rather, their impact has extended far beyond what some may have imagined, reaching countries that had long remained geographically isolated and global tensions, international volatility, and regional wars, particularly those in the Middle East. The impact on geographically distant regions is fundamentally due to the broad and deep interdependence among nations, as well as its interconnected and complex supply chains that now encircle the entire world, facilitating the smooth movement of goods and energy during times of peace, yet rapidly transmitting the consequences of distant crisis through a domino effect during times of turmoil. One of the first and most significant countries historically distant from the global tensions, yet no longer so in recent years, is Australia. Just as Australia has experienced the scourge of terrorism through a number of isolated but revealing incidents that demonstrate the spread of terrorism into new arenas, thereby underscoring the necessity of international cooperation in confronting it and affirming the foresight of the United Arab Emirates, which has taken upon itself the responsibility of combating terrorism globally. The recent war has also revealed the significant economic repercussions affecting Australia, particularly regarding the stability of energy prices and supplies. Hence comes the importance of today's session, not only to understand Australia's position regarding the war in the Middle East, but also to explore how geopolitical transformations in our Arab region have become capable of reshaping calculations related to security, energy, and trade, even for geographically distant powers, and how the Middle East has once again become a pivotal center of international interactions and direct influence on the stability of the global economy and energy and trade routes. It also demonstrates how these developments are driving the reformulation of international positions, strategic alliances, and even domestic policies within affected countries. Recent developments also raise deeper questions regarding the future of international alliances, the limits of the American role in the managing global crises, and the extent to which middle powers and regional actors such as Australia can reshape their strategic approaches towards the Middle East in light of an international environment characterized by high levels of fluidity and uncertainty, and the necessity of engaging in the Middle East to the same extent as engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. In this context, we are pleased to host today a distinguished group of experts and specialized researchers to discuss the dimensions of this important topic, explore its political, economic, and security implications both for the Middle East and for the broader international order, and examine prospects for unconventional cooperations and rapprochements between Australia and the Gulf states, particularly the United Arab Emirates. I look forward, together with you, to a rich and profound dialogue worthy of the significance and complexity of this issue, one that contributes to providing clearer and deeper insights into the nature of the transformations currently taking place within the international system and the repercussions for various international actors. Welcome to you all, and Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sheikha. So the dialogue today will be broadly structured around 4 forms of exposure that Australia has to the Iran war and its effects. And those 4 forms of exposure align with the particular areas of expertise of our 4 speakers. So firstly, Raylene will be touching on Australia's fuel and supply chain vulnerabilities that have really come to light over the past few months. Secondly, Dr. Bruni will be touching on Australia's defence and strategic posture towards the Gulf, towards the US, how the second order effects of this manifest in Australia's strategic posture in the Indo-Pacific. Thirdly, Dr. Gordon will be touching on Australia's trade architecture in the Indo-Pacific, the geo-economic realities of that neighbourhood. And then finally, fourthly, Anthony will be bringing it together by examining Australia's foreign policy approach towards the Middle East, Australia's diplomatic orientation towards the Indo-Pacific, more broadly, the interconnections between this. So clearly these 4 themes of exposures are indeed interconnected in that they involve not just similar geographies and geographic nodes, but they also involve similar infrastructure, whether that's economic infrastructure or diplomatic and relations infrastructure. And thus, it's important for us when we're considering this broader topic to indeed look at these dimensions systemically, which indeed will be aimed to be the framing of today's dialogue. So to kick things off, Raylene, the public conversation in Australia over the past few months since the war has seemed to tend to treat the fuel crisis largely as a price and supply issue. You published a bunch of great analysis where you've argued that what the war has actually exposed for Australia is something more structural about the way Australia's fuel security is wired. Given that, what do the past few months tell us about the architecture of Australia's fuel security? And where are the points in that architecture for you where Australia seems to be the most exposed?
Thank you, Nick. And thank you for the opportunity to open today's panel. The question we've been asked is really timely and necessary. The Iran war has made us question whether the institutional architecture we have built in Australia is actually capable of responding under pressure. The conventional Australian policy debate treats fuel as an energy issue, it treats trade as foreign affairs issues, military deployments as defence, critical minerals as resources, and fertilisers supply as agriculture. The Iran war has shown us that these are not separate problems, they're parts of the single system. Fuel enables logistics, logistics sustains force generation, critical minerals underpin industrial and technological capability, including the inputs required for things like fertiliser. Fertiliser sustains food production and economic stability. So if you disrupt one part of the system, the effects cascade across all of them. So I'll start with fuel for the first example. Our exposure to liquid fuel vulnerability is not new. We've known about it for decades, and we've consistently held fuel stocks that are well below the IEA benchmark of 90 days. Over the past 2 decades, Australia has moved from 8 operating refineries to just 2. So we've steadily trading domestic capability for reliance on imports. We've become structurally dependent on long, complex, and increasingly contested global supply chains, with successive government and industry reviews calling for stronger coordination. The Iran war has also confirmed something we prefer to treat as theoretical and then made it operational whilst the world was watching. And that exposure was our liquid fuel vulnerability. We import 90% of our refined petroleum products needed for our domestic production, largely from Asian refineries, who in turn largely source this from Middle Eastern crude. So this means that the crisis in the Persian Gulf doesn't simply hit Australia through global price movements, it constrains production in Singapore, South Korea and Japan, who also produce the petrol, diesel and jet fuel that we import. The geography of our vulnerability doesn't stop there. So even if the Middle East crude can be rerouted, the refined fuel we import must still pass through maritime channels in Southeast Asia. So around 83% of our maritime imports move through the Indonesian choke points, the Malacca, Lombok and Sunda Straits. So there's also, this is also the second major fuel incident Australia has had. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine saw Australia lose access to its share of the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve, meaning we entered this crisis right now without any redundancy. So effectively, before the Strait of Hormuz closed, Australia only had about 1 month of fuel coverage. The government's response has helped stabilise the situation. Emergency measures were implemented, sovereign reserves were released, a national fuel security plan was developed, demand management was introduced, the Prime Minister engaged in regional partners to secure fuel supply, and a fuel security package was announced. And yet, despite all of that, we still only have right now about 40 to 50 days of liquid fuel, still well below the 90 days benchmark. But those interventions, I think, is really important to point out, were crisis management tools. They stretched the supply, they managed the shortages, but they didn't create resilience. They were delivered in the middle of the Hamas crisis as a reactionary measure, whilst in parallel, we are experiencing domestic stress. And I guess that's the impact of what we're dealing with now, is that continuous cascading events and crises. So whilst we were dealing with the closure of Hamas and trying to negotiate new fuel supplies, we had a fire at one of our 2 remaining refineries, which disrupted the diesel and jet fuel production at the worst possible moment. Simultaneously, we had a shutdown of the Pilbara ammonia plant on the west coast, which curtailed the production of ammonia, which is a key feedstock for fertiliser, and for ammonium nitrate, which is used in mining explosives. And then at the same time, there was a current outage at the other ammonia facility in New South Wales, which tightened supply across the east coast. So we saw a double impact on both sides of the country, with disruption cascading rapidly across fertiliser supply, mining explosives, freight and agricultural production. So whilst fuel attracts the headlines, the Iran war has prompted us to rethink our broader exposure. So with fertiliser, for example, we rely really heavily on inputs that are energy intensive and globally traded. When energy prices rise, fertiliser costs follow. When fertilisers constrain agricultural output comes under pressure. So even where Australia has strong food production capacity, we're still very input dependent. And this is the same for critical minerals. We are a major producer of raw materials, but we remain dependent on external processing, refining and supply chains to turn those materials into usable capability. Maritime disruption affects our export routes, and geopolitical tensions reshape demand and investment. So as countries respond to oil shocks by accelerating to electrification, dependency doesn't disappear, it just shifts. Clean energy supply chains are highly concentrated, particularly in processing manufacturing. So the risk is not only our oil dependence, it's substituting one form of external dependency for another. So across fuel, fertiliser, critical minerals, the pattern is consistent. We've outsourced refining, we've outsourced processing, we have limited storage depth, and we rely on long, vulnerable supply chains. In stable conditions, that system's great, it's efficient, it works well, but in crisis, it becomes fragile. So our strategic position is not determined by what it extracts, it's by what we can process, store and move and sustain under pressure. So it's agreements like the UAE CEPA agreement with Australia that has made a deliberate decision to expand our trade and investment links with the Gulf. And this creates a real opportunity. But it also increases our exposure across energy flows, trade routes and investment pathways. So for us in Australia, the policy question should be whether we have the institutional capability to understand and manage the strategic risk that comes with that engagement. The current framework brings fuel, trade, defence and industry together in a crisis, but Australia still lacks a standing integrated national resilience architecture, one that integrates fuel security, supply chains, industrial capability, defence strategy and posture and economic strategy into a single framework. Resilience isn't a stockpile, it isn't a plan. So the lesson from the Iran war is that exposure is systematic, interconnected and increasingly difficult to manage through fragmented institutional arrangements that activate under stress rather than operate continuously in advance. The Iran war has made that visible to us. So the question I ask now is whether we're treating it as a warning or finally using it as a catalyst for structural change. Thank you.
Thanks, Raylene. And yeah, there's a very deft treatment of all the major pillars of this issue, and particularly in a systemic sense. And you mentioned Australia's refining vulnerability and dependence on Southeast Asian refiners, and the implication of that, as you brought up with your discussion of the reliance on just 2 Australian refineries, indeed one of them which has been damaged, is that, and indeed this aligns with analysis you published on the matter, is pushing forward into perhaps considering increasing Australia's domestic refining capacity. But like you also clearly alluded to, that doesn't extract Australia from its dependence on energy supply chains. And indeed, you brought up the topic of clean energy supply chains also in their own right having vulnerabilities. It seems to me, from looking at the public discussion in Australia from this side of the world, that, okay, there's the discussion about domestic refining capacity. There's sort of the counter, or what some people posit as a counter argument of, well, no, this is this shows that this is the time to push forward into electrification. Firstly, is that a false binary? Is one perhaps the former, the refining capacity, a short-term stopgap while moving towards electrification over the longer term? But most importantly, as you allude to, ensuring that one dependency is not replaced by another. And I think the most important aspect, which you also brought up, is what institutional capacity exists within Australia to consider this in that systemic way. So bringing all that together, how do you see the conversation moving forward, or how should the conversation move forward in terms of addressing the short-term exigencies, the longer-term, let's say, opportunities or necessities, but also building the institutional architecture and that systemic policy approach to dealing with that in the most sustainable way?
I think what we're doing and what we're seeing is that we operate within a system of systems, and they're all interconnected now. And a disruption in one cascades down into others. And what we should be looking at is resilience. And it's not saying that we have to be 100% sovereign capability in developing our own fuel. It's about diversification. So we'll still continue to import fuel. We'll still continue to make fuel, but we should also be looking at things like biodiesel and sustainable aviation fuel and producing those in Australia. We export the majority of our sunflower oil to the EU, who makes biodiesel with it. If we turn to that export inwards, and we could uplift our sovereign manufacturing capability in our agricultural sector. But also provide some resilience by having some of these probably placed in Northern Australia too, given the current refineries are in Southern Australia, and our national transport networks are quite weak. We have large distances, and our national networks are subject to extreme climate events. We have road melt in summer, we have floods in the rain season, and it's very difficult moving things up north where we need them, which I think one of the other speakers might talk about later. So I think it's about resilience is about bouncing back and operating through shock. So what we need to be doing is diversifying and making sure that we're not relying on just one thing, but we have a number of mechanisms or levers up our sleeve.
Brilliant, thanks, Raylene. And well, naturally, the implication of that diversification involves diversification of trade routes and relationships, and primarily that will happen initially across the Indo-Pacific. So, Dr. Brenny, that takes us nicely towards you and your focus here today, and bringing things towards the defence and strategic element of the topic. Australia's response to the war, since the war, has involved well-publicised defence dimensions. So there's been additional ADF personnel deployed to the Gulf, involving surveillance aircraft. Indeed, Royal Australian Navy personnel were indirectly involved in the USS Charlotte's attack on the Iranian ship off the coast of Sri Lanka, which indeed sunk it. And then also there's been the well-publicised rebuke, or indeed set of rebukes, of President Trump criticising Australia for not doing enough in terms of its involvement in his perception. So given all of that exposure, what does this episode, and that episode indeed particularly, tell us about Australia's defence and strategic posture, its coherence, its direction, its challenges, and if you like, where does the Middle East, or where does Middle East engagement fit alongside Australia's Indo-Pacific commitments, AUKUS commitments or trajectory, and indeed the broader alliance with the US? Dr. John. Can you hear us, Dr. Brenny? Dr. John, you're muted.
Hearing you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, excellent. Well, first and foremost, thanks to Trends Research and Advisory for... Hello?
You're muted.
Oh, am I again?
No, we can hear
That
you.
can't be right. I'm not even touching this thing.
Hearing you. Can you hear me? We can.
Oh, I've got that time lag again. It's so annoying.
Thanks to Trends Research and Advisory for... Hello? Oh, am I
That's right, we can hear you now.
I don't know what's going on here.
Change this thing. Oh, I've got that time lag again. It's so annoying.
Okay, am I okay now?
You are.
That's right, we can hear you now. I don't know what's going on.
All right. Okay. I'll give it the best shot I can. I think the technology is failing me today. It's really quite frustrating. But anyway, good afternoon, everyone. First off, I'd like to thank Trends Research and Advisory for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. So let's go straight ahead. The Iran war is really the first big geopolitical shock that's put Australia's economy and strategic position to the test since the start of the second Trump administration. But from an Australian defence perspective, this conflict is important for another reason as well. It is the first time in decades that Australians have been directly exposed to the operational realities of a Middle Eastern war before any formal political decision to go to war was publicly made. That matters. Because one of the key lessons Australia is now confronting is this. Modern conflict doesn't wait for politicians to make announcements. It jumps right into alliances, supply chains, intelligence, shipping routes, cyber networks, and even our people on the ground almost overnight. And that is exactly what happened here. On the 3rd of March, Iranian missile strikes against Al Mahad Air Base in the UAE placed Australian personnel directly in harm's way. On the 4th of March, 3 Australian personnel aboard the submarine USS Charlotte participated in an operation that resulted in the sinking of the Iranian frigate IRIS Dina off Sri Lanka. Then, on the 10th of March, Australia deployed 85 defence personnel, an E-7A Wedgetail airborne early warning aircraft, and AMRAAM missiles to the UAE under what Canberra described as a defensive deployment. In strategic terms, Australia crossed the threshold from observer to a participant remarkably quickly. Now, you might have noticed that Canberra has been pretty careful in how it talks about all of this. The Albanese government has avoided the rhetoric of direct intervention. It has stressed force protection, alliance obligations, regional stability, and defensive support roles. But from Tehran's perspective, and perhaps from much of the broader region's perspective, Australia is no longer simply a distant Indo-Pacific middle power. It is now operationally connected to the US-led Gulf security architecture. And honestly, that's left Australia with some big strategic headaches we're still figuring out. For decades, we Aussies have had this idea baked into our thinking that if we're far away, we're safe. The tyranny of distance protected Australia from the kinds of conflicts that devastated Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. But the Iran war has exposed the limits of that thinking. Australia's economy is critically dependent on energy flows, maritime trade routes, global insurance markets, satellite systems, and alliance-linked logistics chains. Even before direct military involvement, Australians experienced the consequences of the conflict through fuel price spikes, shipping disruptions, financial volatility, and concerns over the disruption to the Strait of Hormuz. Put simply, we don't have to be anywhere near a war to feel its effects back home. That's a pretty big mental shift for us as a country. Because increasingly, Australian national security is no longer defined simply by defending the continent. It is about protecting access to trade, energy, data flows, maritime routes, and alliance systems. And this is where the Gulf suddenly matters enormously to Australia. The Iran war also showed us that the way we've set up our defence force doesn't always match what we're actually facing out there. Australia's defence planning over the last decade has increasingly focused on high-end deterrence, submarines, long-range strike, advanced missile systems, cyber capability, and AUKUS-related force modernisation. But the Gulf conflict has reminded us that relatively inexpensive asymmetric tools can still create strategic shock. Iran did not need a blue water navy to threaten global trade. It used missiles, drones, maritime disruption, proxy networks, and ambiguity. And that leaves Australia with a tough question. Are we preparing for the wars we imagine, or the wars adversaries are actually fighting? Because the Iran war suggests that the future battlefield may not primarily reward the most technologically advanced force. It may instead favor the actor capable of creating sustained disruption at relatively low cost. For Australia, this has direct implications for procurement priorities. Do we need resilience and redundancy alongside prestige capability, more integrated air and missile defense, greater fuel security, larger stockpiles, more hardened northern infrastructure, expanded sovereign manufacturing capacity, and perhaps most importantly, can Australia sustain prolonged operations if global supply chains fracture during simultaneous crises? These are no longer theoretical questions. Now we arrive at the most sensitive issue, AUKUS. AUKUS remains the most consequential and for some the most controversial defence commitment Australia has undertaken in generations. It is not simply a submarine program, it is an attempt to integrate Australia into the technological, industrial, intelligence and strategic architecture of American power. But the Iran war has complicated the political environment surrounding that commitment. Why? Because parts of the Trump administration and broader sections of the American strategic community have openly questioned the reliability and utility of allies unless those allies demonstrate stronger burden sharing and operational support. This creates a dilemma for Canberra. Australia wants the benefits of alliance integration without appearing subordinate to every US military operation globally. But Washington increasingly expects allied alignment as proof of strategic seriousness. So what's Australia doing now? Frankly, we're trying to walk a very fine line, remain deeply embedded in the US alliance system while simultaneously limiting political exposure to a highly unpopular and strategically risky regional war. And honestly, keeping that balance might get trickier over time. Because one of the underlying questions emerging from this conflict is whether middle powers like Australia can maintain strategic autonomy inside increasingly polarized alliance systems. That may become one of the defining geopolitical questions of the next decade. Despite all these challenges, I really do believe Australia has a lot to offer diplomatically. Australia is not a superpower. It cannot independently shape military outcomes in the Gulf. But middle powers can still play stabilizing roles. Australia retains credibility across multiple strategic communities, with the United States, with Gulf partners, including the UAE, across parts of Southeast Asia, and increasingly with India and Japan. That gives Canberra an opportunity, if it chooses to use it, to operate as a pragmatic intermediary power, not neutral and stabilizing, not neutral, but stabilizing. And that distinction matters, because Australia's comparative advantage may not lie in projecting overwhelming force into the Middle East. It may lie in coalition management, strategic diplomacy, intelligence cooperation, maritime coordination, and helping prevent escalation spirals. The Albanese government appears to understand this. Its posture throughout the conflict has been cautious rather than enthusiastic. Canberra sought to reassure Washington without fully embracing its maximalist war aims. It has tried to support regional partners while avoiding rhetoric that would lock Australia into open-ended escalation. From a middle power perspective, this is less of a weakness than a matter of strategic calibration. Let me wrap up this with this thought. The Iran war has revealed something larger than a regional crisis. It has revealed how interconnected modern geopolitics has become. For Australia, a conflict thousands of kilometres away rapidly became an alliance question, an energy security question, a maritime trade question, an intelligence question, a defence procurement question, and ultimately a national resilience question. And perhaps the deepest lesson in this is Australia can no longer think about defence simply in terms of platforms and geography. The real challenge now is strategic endurance. Can Australia withstand prolonged global instability while maintaining alliance credibility, economic resilience, and political independence simultaneously? That is the question this war has forced Australia to confront. And I suspect it is a question many middle powers are now beginning to ask themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brenny. And I would have loved to ask a direct follow-up, but given the difficulties we're having technologically, what I might do is move on from the follow-up question and instead give you the chance at the end to join the open discussion when we wrap things up. So forgive me for that. Technology has defeated us in this instance. Dr. Gordon, Dr. Brenny ended on a very useful segue there in the sense of the inability for Australia, and did anyone, to atomise defence posture, defence networks from trade architectures, trade networks, and indeed to geoeconomic thinking more broadly. This episode for Australia has been yet another instalment, you could say, of, or let's say the latest instalment in a sequence of shocks. So US tariff policy, Ukraine war, COVID, and now the Iran war. A sequence of shocks that have faced the international trade and economic order. You've argued before that these shocks risk pushing the world towards rival economic blocs. Where do you see Australia fitting within that picture, both in terms of this current episode and where it fits more broadly in terms of longer term trends? What does the Iran war's stress on the Indo-Pacific supply chain architecture reveal about the assumptions of Australia's economic model that it has built that model on for some time going back in the past?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this panel with such other great speakers. And I guess I'm going to reflect very similar to Raylene and John in terms of some of the stuff that they mentioned, that it's been a bit of a wake-up call for Australia, that we now they're not going away. So I think there'd always been a bit of a hope that we had COVID, then we had the sort of US disruption where we had the Ukraine war, and then we had the US disruption. So we really got into supply shocks. We got used to the idea of supply shocks, but we were kind of thought we could muddle our way through, and that, there'd be a reversion to mean. And so we didn't have to worry about things too much. And I think this one has really kind of knocked us over the edge. So I think it's worth just going back to a bit of context about where Australia is and what its attitudes are to what's been happening in the world. So you can start with WTO. And under the first Trump administration, the US pulled out of appointing anybody for the appellant body in the WTO. And Biden didn't restore that. And the US continues to question the WTO. They have actually paid their funding for it, which is something, but they're pushing for major changes such as to, equal treatment and the like, which have been the kind of core components of the WTO. But there has been coalitions within the WTO, and Australia has been part of them, to try and find workarounds. And so I think we thought that, that was the way forward. You'd find like-mindeds to find workarounds within the international architecture. And it's going to be really tested. So that's the WTO side of things. The US trade agreements has really trying to change the conversation from, you do trade agreements because they're a really good way of bringing down the transaction costs. The headline stuff is always tariffs and, quotas and things like that. But the real gains from trade agreements come from the trade facilitation that happens. We'll recognize your standards, you'll recognize our standards, we'll streamline the paperwork, we'll make it easier for our businesses to do business in your country and make it easier for you to do business in our country. That's where trade agreements have actually really been powerful. So the headline stuff is often not the important thing. It's actually all the facilitation stuff that goes on behind. And I think that still remains incredibly important. But in fact, possibly even more important these days, that those agreements form foundations of partnership and relationships that we can then use when there are crises. And so we need to build on those in the future. So the third kind of broader trend, other than the US and the trade war that it's been having, and it's leaning on countries to kind of be able to say, well, if you do anything we don't like, we're going to come back and hit you again with, more tariffs. Though they're struggling to work out how they're going to actually hit people with tariffs at the moment. So they've had two rounds of approaches that have failed, but they've got a third round cooking in the background. We had China and China's willingness to use trade sanctions. And so Australia experienced that in 2020 during COVID. We'd said things about, the origins of the COVID pandemic, and we had also sort of banned Huawei. And so China was pretty angry at Australia. So it decided to kind of whack us with a bunch of trade sanctions. And for us, that was blocking our exports to China. So when you think about most trade sanctions, it's sort of saying, well, you can't have access to X. And obviously, the most important one at the moment is the Chinese ruling on critical minerals and anything that has components of critical minerals therein. And that one has been paused for a year in the sort of the battle with the US to try and get better US relations. So it's there sitting there on the books that can be triggered anytime they like, and that's a problem. But that then is why this rush to critical minerals and critical minerals being the way forward and engagement on critical minerals has become the big conversation. But that stuff takes time. That's the sort of thing that you've got a 5-year time horizon at least, probably a 10-year time horizon. China has the technologies for processing that we really don't have anywhere else. And so excluding China from that is actually going to be really problematic. So we've got that happening. And then what Australia's been trying to do is try and walk that tightrope between retaining our engagement with the US on the sort of security front and then being able to continue to trade with China. And then just the same way with Southeast Asia, they're trying to walk a tightrope as well to say they've got major Chinese investments. It's a source of a lot of technology for them, as it is increasingly for us, particularly in EVs and in green tech. And so how can you manage some of the security risks that might be inherent in those trade flows? But also how do you walk that tightrope between two entities where, particularly when the US is so unpredictable? And so this is the background of where Australia has been going and what it has been doing. So we can think about the kind of pre-COVID and all of this. We had the CPTPP, which is the Comprehensive Partnership Treaty that the US had been involved in the original round of negotiations on, and then they pulled out under the Trump administration. And in fact, previously, I mean, there was indications the US wasn't going to sign even if Hillary Clinton had got in. And so that is a trade agreement that has got some new members. Other countries, the UK has recently joined, are trying to join that trade agreement. We have RCEP, which is a less stringent type of trade agreement. It's more an agreement to cooperate. So that is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that China is a part of. India pulled out of that at the last moment. It's a real pity that India as a major producer isn't in that trade agreement. And so there's this architecture sitting there that's regional kind of architecture. There's a WTO sitting there. And then what Australia has been trying to do is saying, how can we rescue the international rules-based order, which is really about saying what we want is a set of rules that by and large benefit most countries. It supports relatively free trade and investment. It supports trade facilitation and getting rid of barriers and the like, in order that we can grow our economies. And you've got a US that sort of, and it's fairly bipartisan, that has just decided that system has not benefited them. It has, but right now they don't think it has. And so they're quite happy to undermine that. You have China, who actually still relies on that system and doesn't that system. And then you have a bunch of global South countries that sort of want to change it. So how do we put this war in context? It just kind of puts everything on steroids. And there's a real, Australia's reaction has been, well, we'll have Future Made in Australia, which tries to invest more in, some of the key capabilities here. We'll have, we're talking about strategic reserves and things like that, but most of it's about partnerships. And so Australia's response to this is our Prime Minister has got on planes and gone and talked to a whole bunch of countries in the region. So particularly, agreements with Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Japan, and effectively kind of done a bit what we sort of didn't think we wanted to do. We wanted to find the win-wins that everybody agreed on, and not and we've got a hammer, we can clobber you back. But certainly it's been suggested we export a lot of gas and they import a lot of our gas. And so there's a bit of a tit for tat. Let's work together because of our mutual interest in working together. And so I think that, to my mind, is probably one of the biggest changes that in terms of Australia's sort of way of going forward, is we've never kind of really used it as explicitly as we have used it as the Prime Minister has raced around. As Raylene said, we're not prepared for this. And so we're now running around madly trying to find ways to keep things moving. And then we do things that make it a little harder, like, putting halving the fuel excise to bring the prices down, and telling everybody they should go away for Easter. Because we kind of live in hope that it'll all be fixed, right? Australians are still rather, she'll be right, mate. It'll all sort itself out. And I think there's a lot in what Raylene was saying about, we actually need to recognize that all these things are interconnected. And we have to have some really hard discussions about how much this is going to cost and how much we can actually achieve without it being about partnerships. Because quite frankly, Australia is incredibly dependent on commodity prices globally. Commodity prices globally depend on demand. Demand depends on economic growth throughout the world. And so our best interest is served by the end of this war, the Middle East really getting back on a growth trajectory, Africa growing, all those things would be really good for Australia. So we have a vested interest in trying to play that mediating role and be proactive in trying to make sure we don't end up where we could end up, which is in a much poorer, more disrupted world where everybody tries to look after themselves.
Dr. Gordon, thank you. There's a lot that I could follow up on there and try and build off, in the sense of the tail wagging the dog of Australian policy historically and currently, and shifting from reactiveness to proactiveness, and doing that through appreciating the system and the system's context of all these things. But just in the interest of time, I'll have to move on to Anthony, and then I'll open the floor again in a way that will hopefully enable us to follow up on those sorts of dynamics. So Anthony, as it's become very clear, definitely throughout, particularly also in Dr. Bruni's talk, Australia now has more operational engagement in the Middle East than arguably at any point in recent memory. So the forces, the aircraft deployed, but also if we're looking at the trade and the economic side of things, a recently signed CEPA with the Emirates, and indeed demands from the US for more Australian contribution in a strategic and defence sense in the region. So given that context, Australia's foreign policy architecture in this region, in the Middle East, now seems to face the challenge of keeping up with that elevated multifaceted engagement. So given that, what do these past few months tell us about where Australia's Middle East foreign policy is at, or indeed where it's set to be, where our interests are currently, where our interests are set to be and need to be, and indeed what does developing strategic Australian foreign policy in this region now look like?
Thanks, Nicholas, and happy to join the panel. I think to understand where we are at the moment, it's important to have a bit of historical context and recent historical context. I mean, obviously, Australia has had interests and a presence in the region stretching back to World War One, and I'm not going to go through that entire history. But I think the best point to start is really in 2001, where as a result of 9/11, as a result of the subsequent war in Afghanistan, but also then the war in Iraq, Australia entered a kind of an enhanced phase of engagement in the region, and driven primarily by a desire to be a good ally to the US, but also a good international citizen in terms of kind of joining in an international campaign against terrorism. But it's also in this period that partly independently and partly in interrelated way, our relationships in the region also became more enhanced. You know, the Australia's diplomatic network expanded in the Gulf in particular. We've seen the development of strategic relationships with key countries in the region, including the UAE, partly as a consequence of just the operational requirements of participating in the war in Afghanistan and the subsequent war in Iraq. We based our military forces there. And then secondary to that, we developed partnerships with the UAE, with other countries in the region that flowed out of that, and they've now developed a bit of a life of their own. We've seen CEPA and the economic relationship, which is also in many ways a kind of independent, has occurred independently of those trends. So where I would kind of slightly disagree with you is that I actually think in recent years we've seen not a diminution, but a change in Australia's, let's call it, kind of foreign policy posture in the region. So if you take the beginning of that period in 2001, as I said, the things that really drove our engagement in the Middle East was being a good ally to the United States, being a good international citizen, but also looking after our own economic interests, looking after the presence of large Australian expat communities in the region, the kind of the people-to-people connections driven by the fact that large numbers of migrants from the region, lived in Australia. What's been really interesting in recent years is that the balance between those drivers has shifted. So over the last 4 years, whilst we have still tried to be a good ally to the US, you've seen for the first time really some significant gaps open up between US and Australian policy in the region. So you saw that over the Gaza war, where the Australian government took the decision to recognise a Palestinian state, very much at odds with American policy. You've seen that over this last war in Iran, where even though the Prime Minister publicly declared his support for American strikes on Iran, it was clear that there was some apprehension about the direction of US policy in the region. And there's an argument to be had, and there's a truth somewhere in there about whether the US actually requested Australian assistance, the government, to kind of help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The government says there was no request. So, I'm sure the truth is in there somewhere, but clearly there is also a bit of distance between the US and Australia on that. We still want to be a good international citizen in the region, and that's why we are outside of the kind of US efforts, participating in other international efforts to try and support the reopening of international of the Hormuz Straits. We are pursuing our own economic interests in the region, and what's interesting there is you've seen the continuation of a trend of for independent reasons, deepening relations with key countries in the region, the UAE being one of them. And the other thing I'd say is that all of this is happening against a background where this Australian government has said that our main priority, or the government's main priority, is to focus on the Indo-Pacific. And it's fairly clear that they don't define the Indo-Pacific. And it's not just this government, the previous government also didn't define the Indo-Pacific to include the Gulf. So the Indo-Pacific, the definition of Indo-Pacific that they've used and they've articulated basically ended at India. So, in a sense, you've seen in response to the Iran crisis, in some ways, actually, yes, the decision to send AWACS aircraft to the UAE and to supply missiles, you've seen a bit of re-engagement, but against a trend where basically the government has been trying to shift its focus primarily to the Indo-Pacific, to Asia. You saw that, for example, there was not necessarily a request, but possibly an expectation that Australia would participate in some kind of naval mission to keep the Red Sea open during that period when the Houthis were carrying out attacks there. In the past, when US and Australian policy in the Middle East was perhaps a bit closer, you might have seen Australia respond with the dispatch of a naval vessel to support the reopening of the Straits of Hormuz, but that's clearly not on the cards. Even though I think Australia are capable of doing it, and even though for long periods of the kind of since 2001, Australia did maintain a fairly constant naval presence in the region. So I think what we've seen is a response to the kind of the needs of the moment, but I think the trend is notwithstanding the maintenance of some really of a few key relationships in the region, notwithstanding the pursuit of economic opportunities in the region, a kind of a desire by the government to remain fairly disciplined and focus on Asia. That's not like every government, certainly for a country of Australia's size, has to have foreign policy priorities. Not every region could be treated equally. And that's not to say that the Middle East and the Gulf is not important to Australia, but it's clearly a second priority in comparison to Asia. The really interesting question that emerges, though, is does the conflict in Iran, and does in particular the impact it's had on our fuel supply, change the government's thinking about where the Indo-Pacific starts and where it ends? Because there is also an opportunity to say that, in fact, what we should be doing is expanding our conception of the Indo-Pacific to include the Gulf. That may happen. It's still early days. I haven't seen any evidence of it. And it's noteworthy that in the context of the diplomacy that the government has undertaken to respond to the Gulf crisis has been primarily in Asia, right? It's been about the Prime Minister getting on a plane to go to Southeast Asia and other Asian capitals to secure fuel supply. We haven't really chosen to step up our diplomatic engagement in the region, other than in some very specific cases like the UAE, but that's primarily a function of the strength of the bilateral relationship rather than any shift in Australian policy.
Anthony, thank you very much. I love the way this is all just naturally coalesced together in the sense of these interconnections have flown naturally through what you've all made very explicit in your remarks. While sure we've moved between sort of the more granular aspects of energy security through to defence posture, through to trade architecture, through to sort of foreign policy paradigms even, the through lines have been very clear in that there is a need to integrate these different streams of policy thinking. There's an inability to rely on old ways of doing foreign policy, economic policy, and rely on, or at least rely solely on, old partnerships. So clearly, throughout all of your remarks, there's a commonality in the need to change the policy thinking at the paradigm level. So the challenge, therefore, and I think this is a good way to wrap things up and open the floor to all of you, is changing thinking at that sort of level is often done by sort of granular steps, manifesting things tangibly in policy context. So whether that involves the way that particular relationships are developed, or even within relationships, what are the particular modes and resources like comprehensive economic partnerships or free trade agreements. There's also sort of the domestic dimension. However, does Australian policy ecosystems develop that interconnection between the various departments and ministries? So I'll open the floor to all of you and to anyone who would like to jump in and say, okay, given that the agreed upon need to change things sort of at the more paradigm level in terms of policy thinking, in any respect, in any way, when you look forward, what are the areas, the mechanisms, the resources, the relationships, what have you, that are the most, let's say, low-hanging fruit, easy to grab mechanisms that Australia can grab onto, whether just domestically or in partnership with others, in order to start addressing these issues that I just referred to? Please, Dr. Gordon.
I'll jump in to put my 2 cents in. I think it comes down to the relationships we have, the international relationships, and how to actually manage those well, and how to find the areas of common interest. So there had been a bit of a tendency for everybody to want to bring everything to bear in an agreement, and kind of go, we need to get agreement on all this stuff, including human rights stuff and everything else. And I think we've got to narrow it down and go, where can we find those commonalities of interest within those frameworks that we've got? And then I think domestically, sort of move away from export good, import bad kind of rhetoric, which still hangs around trade agreements, to understanding that actually this is about building a diversity of relationships across a range of different common interests. And we need little groups within government to come together in a task force to do that particular thing. Because, it's such a complex system. We've got to decide we need this. Here's the partners we can work with, because they also want to be part of this. And you don't make it an exclusion. You always welcome anybody else who wants to come into that agreement. But at least you've got the core of something that you then work on. And ideally, you sort of patchwork this thing together, and eventually they start merging and coalescing back into something more like what we want to think of as an agreed international rules-based order. But I think we've got to remake it that way. Don't get rid of the institutions we've got, but use them to support those agreements where there's a collective interest, a bunch of countries who can do that. And you've got to kind of reflect that within the Australian government by pulling the people out of the agencies to work together on that particular issue.
Absolutely. And well, never waste a good crisis, right, Dr. Jordan? So I think, again, the implication of a lot of what you've all said today is that whether we like it or not, we being, let's say, Australia in this instance, has been dragged into a position of having to change the way it pursues partnerships and what resources it deems as the most strategic, and how it structures those in systems. And, Dr. Gordon, you mentioned in an interagency sense, domestically in Australia, I think that there's also, the opportunity for Australia, and indeed any other state, in the way it pursues its partnerships, to, don't just pursue them in the sense of accessing things, but also expanding the scope of your knowledge about what the real reality of the system you both occupy is. So to end, bringing this into a sort of neat UAE Australia context, perhaps as the CEPA moves forward, that's a particular opportunity for both parties, given that Australia and the Emirates both face imperatives to redesign the way they connect with the world and architectures, whether they be diplomatic or economic, and therefore, the opportunity for both parties to, build that common understanding of what the real nature and the opportunities and challenges within that system they both occupy are. So, look, on that forward-thinking note, sadly, as much as there are many questions I'd love to keep following up with, we'll have to end it there for now. But as I said, this is just the beginning of Trends engagement with Australia. There'll be many more of these, and we genuinely can't wait to start building those with you all moving forward. So thank you very, very much to you all. There's been a whole lot to take away from this. And with that, I'll hand back over to Moza to wrap up and to conclude today's discussion. But thank you very much once again.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, as we conclude this rich and insightful session, it is increasingly clear that the war in the Middle East can no longer be viewed as a regional conflict with consequences limited to the parties directly involved to neighboring states attempting to avoid escalation. Rather, it has evolved into a critical test of the international system's capacity to contain crisis and prevent the expansion of their cross-border repercussions. Today's discussions highlighted how Australia, as an influential middle power and a key Western ally, perceives developments in the Middle East as closely tied to global energy security, the stability of the international economy, the security of maritime trade routes, and the broader strategic balance within the Indo-Pacific region. The session also reaffirmed that despite that many transformations and conflicts the Middle East has experienced over the decades, the region continues to occupy a central role in shaping the trajectory of international politics. Any major disruption within the region is rapidly reflected across different parts of the world, including countries once considered geographically distant from traditional areas of tension. In today's increasingly interconnected world, geography alone is no longer sufficient to protect states from the consequences of the crisis and conflicts, as it may have been the case historically. This reality underscores the urgent need for the international community to strengthen mechanisms of cooperation and dialogue, prioritize political and diplomatic solutions to prevent further escalation and instability, and build new frameworks of trust and collective responsibility capable of addressing threats not only to regional peace and security, but to international peace and security as a whole. Within this context, the role of the United Arab Emirates stands out clearly through its continued efforts to support regional stability, promote dialogue, address extremism, terrorism, and advance balanced approaches aimed at preserving international peace and security. In closing, I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to our distinguished guests for their invaluable insights and thoughtful analysis, and to our esteemed audience for their engagement and participation. I would also extend my thanks to the Trends team, who I am proud to be part of, for organizing this important intellectual dialogue, and we look forward to welcome you again in future sessions of the Trans Strategic Dialogue. Thank you.